because as we all know, it can be really difficult, toxic and problematic how we talk about this issue. But one of the things I'm most pleased about is that we are here and we are talking about this, and it's no longer a sort of the third rail of how we talk about housing and homelessness. So we are really pleased with some of the grand political commitments that are out there from governments at the moment. The Scottish Government has a commitment to end homelessness and a plan to deliver it. The Welsh Labour Government has a emerging plan for ending homelessness, and the Westminster Government has a commitment to ending rough sleeping. But our view is that really you can only have those grand commitments if you're talking about everyone, and everyone must mean everyone. And we've got to stop this kind of distinction between those who do and don't qualify for support. Crisis exists to end homelessness in Britain, not just for those people who are born here, but for everyone that comes to us. Our services are open to everyone, and our policy solutions and our evidence says that obviously homelessness can be ended. It's a public health disaster, it's an individual nightmare, it makes no sense economically, and eventually we think a Westminster government will commit to ending homelessness and deliver the things that are necessary to do that, but it can only be done if we take it on as a comprehensive issue that needs dealing with for everyone who experiences it. So a significant proportion of people experiencing homelessness in the UK come from another country, and we will never end homelessness if we don't tackle homelessness, particularly amongst non-UK nationals, and at the moment, particularly amongst EU nationals within that group. Many of the aspects of homelessness are the same for people, regardless of where they come from. It's to do with poverty, destitution, disadvantage, inequality, but non-UK nationals also face a particular set of obstacles in this country when they are at risk of homelessness or are experiencing it and can't get out of it. So that's why in a couple of weeks we will launch a national campaign on this issue with new data and with a kind of sense of purpose that we need to flush this issue out and talk about it openly and with some maturity. The campaign will advocate for a specific package of support for, targeted at people from the EU who are sleeping rough and homeless in this country. And we've recruited an experts by experience panel which informs our policy and campaigns work. Katia, who we're going to hear from shortly, has agreed to be part of that and has helped us put together not just a human story about what this issue really means to people, but what the right solutions are for her and others. I'm pretty sure that no one in society wants to see anyone sleeping rough. No one wants to see homelessness, and I do think that there is a consensus on that, but at the same time there's a combination of formal and informal policies that make it more difficult for migrants without legal status to get work, housing, healthcare, rent a property, and these have resulted in a intentional and sometimes unintentional hostile environment which makes it much harder for non-UK nationals. An example of this is in December last year when the Home Office decided that rough sleeping would qualify for somebody having their leave to remain cancelled, which is effectively a deportation policy based on rough sleeping, which we very strongly opposed, and 40,000 people joined us in opposing that. And of course, this is all made worse by the perception amongst some politicians that the EU referendum result meant that voters are hostile towards policies that help immigrants, and that any discussion of public funds going to people who are not from the UK is a political minefield. So with this in mind, we commissioned Britain Thinks to help us with that. So we have a solid view of the policy changes that are needed to address the issue, but we also suspect it's about attitudes as much as individual policies. And we wanted to explore how politicians and charities and others can communicate more constructively about this. We learnt that for the majority, homelessness is a topic they care deeply about, but they rarely think that someone experiencing homelessness could also be a non-UK national, and that their immigration status might be the barrier that is actually creating or sustaining their homelessness. And concerns over illegal immigration appear to have contributed to a lack of action in tackling homelessness amongst UK nationals. And every day you see coverage of cross-channel crossings. Again, it sort of clouds what the real issue is for people who are here and who are homeless. So There was a relatively widespread support for a range of specific policy initiatives which feel reasonable and equitable, such as improving decision-making processes in the immigration system, better access to legal advice. And generally we found that if we focus our framing on universal issues like fairness, equality, equity, we get a more constructive response. Similarly, we have a better hearing when we make strong moral statements or talk about practical things like integration, employment opportunities, economic contribution. Britain thinks develop some guidelines to help us communicate this issue with the public, which we hope politicians and others will start to find helpful. So it's little tricks that are common sense, but instead of migrant, talk about non-UK national. Talk about people seeking safety or fleeing persecution, rather than loaded terms like asylum seeker, or people with no immigration status rather than undocumented migrant. But what we're really interested in here, I suppose, is what we actually do about it. Yes, we do need to change the framing of this to get the right response from people. And many people have spoken to us about the challenges they faced claiming benefits or assistance from their council because they were unaware or couldn't access entitlements to support, or they faced language difficulties, struggled to find the documentation they need to support their claims, such as proof of employment. So the ask for the politicians in the room is to support a tailored housing and employment support package for EU nationals who are rough sleeping and homeless. So help with employment, help with legal advice, help with specialist mental health and other forms of services like that, emergency accommodation for absolutely everyone if they need it as a complete backstop, and access to housing rights more generally. And of course all of this in accessible services, particularly for people who don't speak English very well. And in addition to the pragmatic solutions, I think it's important that we say that we also need a principled stand here. That having a home is a basic human need and should apply to absolutely everyone, regardless of whether or not they were born in the UK. Yeah. In the end, we need our politicians to set a humane and principled tone, to acknowledge the reality on our streets that some people are routinely and systematically failed because of where they were born, and that however we talk about it, we need action. So our campaign and report in November will detail the scale of this issue, the human impact of this issue on real people on the streets every day, but more importantly, we'll bring to life those stories more directly. And I'm really glad that Katia is here today to do exactly that for us. And I'm looking forward to launching this campaign and getting this issue into the public realm in a way that I think so many of you will agree is long, long overdue, and to politicians setting a tone that gets us somewhere progressive in the future. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Marley.
Thank you very much, Georgina. So to complement a lot of the work that Matt just talked about, we've been working with Crisis. We at IPPR have been working with Crisis and Heriot-Watt University to do a long and detailed piece of research on the scale and experiences of EEA citizens over the past 18 months. Of course, a lot has happened over the past 18 months. We've had COVID, we've had the impacts of Brexit, but we've been trying to track some of those experiences through surveys, through quantitative analysis, and through lots of interviews with people who have been experiencing homelessness. And what we found is that there are a set of quite distinctive issues facing EEA citizens in the UK that are a bit different to the experiences of homeless among UK citizens, which tend to often have multiple and complex needs, whether that's mental health issues or substance misuse and so on. In this community tends to be that these issues are less common, and we have a much more distinctive set of issues, often based around quite extreme forms of poverty. And there are particular challenges here, issues around rough sleeping, also sofa surfing, severe overcrowding, a lot of people who are in temporary accommodation because of everyone in. And what we tried to do is try to understand what the underlying issues were, why this was happening over the past 18 months. And what we've done, and I'll pick out a little bit of the research here before it's published next month, just to give a taste of what we found. So we found three interlinked but independent set of issues. Firstly, there were a set of quite serious structural issues that face our economy and face everyone in our economy, but that particularly affect EEA citizens. We know, first of all, that there are serious failures within our labour market, and that affects everyone, of course. But we know in particular that EEA citizens are more likely to be in low-paid, insecure and precarious jobs. And we know that at the extreme end of that, that some EEA citizens are vulnerable to exploitation, working in the shadow economy, might be working extremely long hours for very low pay, sometimes under the minimum wage, and sometimes not being paid at all. And so that's one set of real structural issues that face EEA citizens and that contribute to the current challenges. A second set is housing costs, and clearly real difficulties here for EEA citizens to get on the housing ladder like everyone, but particularly for EEA citizens who often are concentrated in the private rental sector, who are concentrated in poor quality, overcrowded accommodation, and who are particularly vulnerable to exploitative landlords as well. So again, the problems with the housing market that affect everyone particularly affect EEA citizens. And then finally, of course, you add on top of that the big issue of the past 18 months, which has been COVID. And you have lots of people who were in precarious housing, who were in precarious work, suddenly finding that work and that housing drying up overnight because of the virus and the ensuing lockdowns. And of course, that's not to say that there was a really big issue with homelessness before the pandemic, but this has really been exacerbated over the past 18 months. We found experiences from lots of people who are in work such as construction, such as cleaning, who found they just couldn't make ends meet, they couldn't find the work after the lockdown began. So alongside these structural issues, we found that there were also quite individual, personal or relational issues that affected EU citizens and that led to a spiral of impacts. And of course, these are the sorts of things that affect everyone who experience some real difficulties and hardships and destitution. So there's nothing in particular here, but again, it's worth pointing out that these are the types of issues that the people we spoke to faced. And that included things like relationship breakdowns, included bereavement, included health problems, both physical health problems and mental health problems, and also alcohol use as well. And obviously these things, when coupled with the structural issues, created a spiral of traumatic incidents that in many cases led to people becoming destitute and homeless. Of course, you also add on top of that many EEA citizens may have come to the UK recently and don't have the kind of support networks, the kind of family and friendship networks that others might have. And so that means they don't have that level of support when they face crisis situations. Finally, the third key area of challenge, which Matt has already touched on, are the systemic issues, the issues with our current policy. And of course, if we had a robust framework for protecting people, then if people meet these crisis situations, they would be able to turn to support from local or central government. But unfortunately, because there are gaps in our current social safety net, we found that many people have ended up destitute and homeless because of these challenges. And these are obviously related to issues that affect everyone, including people from the UK, from the EU, and from elsewhere. But there are also very specific issues that have affected EEA citizens over the past couple of years. One really important one is that many EEA citizens are not entitled to universal credit at all, or indeed to local homelessness assistance. Because they do not have what's called a right to reside in the UK. To some extent, the EU settled status scheme has helped that, because if you have settled status, then you can get that right to reside. But if you don't get full settled status, i.e. you've only been here for less than 5 years and you get pre-settled status, that means you don't get access to that support unless you're able to qualify in some other way, such as you're working or you're a family member of a worker or so on. So if you're unemployed, if you've only been here recently and you're an EU citizen, you may not be entitled to any support whatsoever from the state. And that is really concerning. Secondly, even if you are entitled, you may be subject to long delays in terms of accessing that support from DWP, or to other barriers due to a lack of documentation, or many people aren't necessarily aware of the support that they are entitled to, or there may be English language barriers that make it harder for them to access that support. And finally, coming importantly to the EU settlement scheme, which has been the scheme to protect EU citizens who are living in the UK because of Brexit. There are issues with that scheme that meant that many people have been waiting for their status to come through, and that has meant delays to being able to get their benefits and their housing support, and that has contributed to some of the issues that we're seeing. So, just to briefly sum, and obviously Matt has gone into this in more detail, but what do we think needs to be done? Well, I say there are three broad issues to think about here. One are about the kind of fundamental structures of our economy. I think that needs to be thought about. This is not an issue just about EEA citizens. This is about the entire economy and how it functions, about low wages, exploitation, high housing costs, rogue landlords and so on. And this needs to be thought about in the round. This isn't just a question of immigration or homelessness policy. This goes much broader. Secondly, we do need, as Matt said, a tailored package of support for EEA citizens, focusing on things like employment support, on language, and on immigration advice. And finally, I'd say we need better protections in our immigration system. We need our immigration system to be designed in a way that ensures that people are able to get that support. So that it's not just in a crisis that, such as the pandemic, that people can access things like temporary accommodation, but this is available all the time. And I just end by saying, we're seeing again this risk now emerging. These rumours over the past few days, and I think the announcement today that the government is now putting forward a temporary visa scheme for EU citizens who want to come to work as HGV drivers or want to work in the food processing sector. The risk is here that we have the same problem, that people are in the UK for 3 months, they lose their status after that, and if they are still here, they lose all their rights to benefits, to renting, to employment. And we could see new forms of homelessness emerge because of the government's immigration policy. So we need to think very hard when we design our immigration policy about unintended consequences and about the impacts on things like homelessness.
Thank you so much to both of you for that very comprehensive introduction. And I have just noticed you're wearing matching suits, which just really makes me very happy. So, and if anyone needs to sit, there is seats at the front still available. Katja, we are on to you now. Shall I jump to this?
At 21, I got my accountancy diploma in Italy, and a couple of days after, well, maybe not a couple of days after, but soon enough, I was on a plane for London to improve my English. This was the early 1992. English was the European language. It was the most commonly used language between the different European nationals, as it was easy and accessible to all. I spent a year in the UK, having learned no English at all, but having had the time of my life. I did come back eventually in 1995, and over the next 26 years, I had different jobs in the UK for different companies, such as Cancer Research, H&M, William Hill, and many others. All the time, I have paid my taxes. I've gladly contributed to the economy of my adopted country. I became homeless in 2015, a few days before Christmas. The narrative about EU national had changed dramatically in the intervening year. New Labour has gone and left. We now face austerity, the hostile environment, Brexit. There was a certain animosity toward European due to the xenophobic tone of the 2016 referendum campaign. Being homeless is always difficult. It's even more difficult in a hostile environment. Personally, it was even harder because I was fighting another battle. I was fighting a battle with depression. When I became homeless, I did everything I was supposed to do to help myself. I went to my local council in Hackney. They couldn't do anything. When I finally walked inside Crisis a few days before Christmas 2051, I was sleep deprived. I lost an enormous amount of weight. I couldn't think straight, to be fair. Crisis over the year has helped me to rebuild my life for the better. I'm a better person because of what happened to me, that's for sure. However, I wouldn't wish this on anyone. When I was homeless, I felt like that because of the hostile environment brought about by the now Prime Minister, because of the hostile environment and the narrative toward European, I was being considered just another European here, just to pick up, another free handout at the expenses of the British taxpayer, although until a few days earlier, I was paying the taxes. So anyway, I was very angry and powerless, let's put it like that. It took me 20 years to carve a place in this country. And then from one day to another, I was made to feel that I was unwelcome, I wasn't unwanted. And that's the worst thing, really, and that's something that I'll never forget, ever forget. I'm here today asked to put a human face to what it means to be a homeless person when you come from a European country. But really, I can be any one of you, because the reality is anyone can become homeless. There seems to be this perception that only messed up people end up on the street. I'm sorry, that's not true. This is not the reality of the UK in 2021. Reality is many more people will become homeless because of what we've been going through for the last couple of years. And the reality is there isn't there a system that can help or intervene. Bear with me. During the pandemic, homelessness was treated as a public health issue, and rightly so. So everyone was home regardless of their immigration status. And that was right. And that also shows us that where there is a will, there is a way. If EU citizens and other people outside of the European Union are not given the support that they need, homelessness cannot be ended. Crisis has been filling the gap of a defective system for 50 years now. But we need everyone. Everyone can do their own bit. I've recently turned 50, like Crisis, and I really hope that by the time I'm gonna reach my 60, I don't have to see people sleeping rough in the street. It breaks my heart. It does break my heart. Because the reality is many people will not survive the street. I barely did. So, like I said, everyone has a part to play. Everyone has. And I really do hope that you will feel that, you will back this very important campaign Crisis is launching. Yes, this is about European citizens, but then again, as the previous speaker have said, how can we think of ending homelessness if we are going to discriminate about who is homeless? Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Katja. I think I speak for everyone when I say we really appreciate your honesty in sharing all that with us today. Now we're going to hear from Barbara Droskowicz, who is the CEO of the East European Resource Centre.
Hello everyone, can you hear me? Hi, my name is Barbara. I'm not forcing you to, I'm just measuring my time because I know that I can speak without taking breath for 4 days about homelessness among migrants. So please do bear with me. So I'll be looking here. Yes, so my name is Barbara. I'm a migrant. I have come here to UK in 2008, so I've been here 13 years. That was supposed to be a gap year. You know how it is with gap years. I used to work in homelessness organization back at home, back in Poland. I'm so sorry, I just feel very awkward right here. And I just really wanted to know why people are coming over to UK and basically end up homeless, and then really want to go back and keep on being homeless in Great Britain. So that, this is very simplifying the picture, but this is how I saw that in 2008. We are looking at really sort of interesting period of huge dynamic in migrant, European inter-migration. So I came over and I sort of stayed. And I have been with my organization, East European Resource Center, since 2012. So we have gone through austerity, the B word, which is Brexit, the C word, which is COVID. And we are here. We are here, and to be honest, my personal dream as a professional is to close my charity down. Not because I believe we are doing horrible work, but I believe we shouldn't even exist. The work that we are doing should be done by the system and mainstream charities. Now, I'll tell you what we do actually before I move on to other equally uninteresting things. We provide very targeted intervention, advice, advocacy and support for Eastern European migrants living in London, home counties, and occasionally the whole UK. Though that work comprises of specialist advice and casework in welfare, housing, debt cases. We have independent modern slavery advocacy, independent DV advocacy, independent hate crime advocacy. We also have isolation support for people who are homebound, and also we run community peer support groups for those who need support networks but not need advice or advocacy processes to sort of decrowd the advice advocacy processes. I sound like GP speaker. And we have been having quite a few clients over the last 40 years as we exist. But just to give you an example, in 2019, 20 years, we had over 8,000 single unique new users. In the 18 months to date, which is basically 18 months of COVID, we've had 6,000 new unique users. So that's been sort of lots of stuff going on in our corner. Now, just to, so it's been fun. It's just basically been fun to run this organization since 2012. You can imagine that every moment when I think that everything is going fine, everything is fine, there is something happening, Brexit referendum or pandemic, global pandemic, that unfortunately makes our work sort of being refreshed. Just to give you just a very quick, I just realized that when we are talking about Eastern Europeans, we are talking about a very particular group of EU nationals who are the 2004-2007 accession country nationals. The biggest two of those nations are represented in Europe, but also in UK are obviously Poles and Romanians. And they consist, overall, we consist only 45% of the whole European family as estimated to live in UK now. But if you listen to who Europeans are, you would see the cabbage pickers. I'm not going to dwell into the narratives, but this is not entirely homogeneous group. No migrant group is homogeneous, and I really need to strongly make that point that the presentation of destitution, homelessness, and poverty might be different across different nations. Having said that, we are also a member of migrant family, and lots of things that I will just now very quickly say apply to all of us. I'm sure I will make the concessions where these situations are different. So I just wanted to take a different view on what Marley said quickly, briefly through the IPPR research, which we are very, very interested to see the full findings, obviously. I'm going to take a different take on it because I think that, from our point of view, our work, there are issues that are universal across homeless population or people who are in situation of risk of immediate homeless or hidden homelessness. One thing that might not be popular to say, but I'm taking this risk now because I think that I am not very wrong here, is that lots of homelessness that exists among Eastern European, in particular migrants, it will be different with third country nationals, is in fact internationally displaced homelessness. So people who are affected by particular issues just because they are affected by particular issues displace their homelessness, bring it here. It also means that the reconnection schemes are usually failures because you basically remove homelessness back to the source of this homelessness. And for this reason, we, in 95% of cases, disagree with the rationale of them, although having said that, there are a few cases where they make sense. Because it is, to a certain extent, displaced homelessness, so homelessness that is sort of would happen anyway or is happening anyway in life of people. That is sort of accompanied with similar to generic homeless problems in terms of getting out of homelessness. So inability to find and maintain work is one of the big ones. That will be family breakdown, estrangement, a loss of children is another big contributing factor. It is a big contributing factor in Eastern European homelessness because of particular underlying reasons. And those underlying reasons, I think we all share, whether we are born in Britain or we are born elsewhere in the world, but we are at risk of homelessness or homeless. And these are obviously from our experience of working with our fellow expatriates is, well, addictions, obviously. Mental health, physical health, and cognitive impairments support that is lacking. Again, all that stuff is existing in British homeless as much as it is in Polish, Romanian, or Latvian. What is slightly different here, we believe, is experience of violence in family environment. Again, it will be probably the theme seen across homelessness cohorts. But in particular, in Eastern European culture, in particular in families coming from abject poverty that has been cultured over the 50 years after the war, the level of family violence is gobsmacking, and that cannot be ignored simply because that impacts on the over-reliance on family. It's a codependent relationship with oppressive relationship that leads to I want to say institutionalization, but it's not in fact institutionalization, it's a family institutionalization. And finally, the fourth big one is experience of violence and mistrust experience on the hands of the state. Anything from abusive schooling systems all the way through prison and experiences of care. I hope that will be, I'm running out of time, I'm fully aware of it, I'm so sorry. So I will stop talking. But what I want to say is I will not yet stop talking, just one last thing. Just one last thing, yes, I'm getting there. So all in all, there is quite a lot of things that makes us all even sort of equal homeless family. What makes us stand out is immigration status, in fact, and the fact that the immigration status underpins eligibility criteria for support. Now, so what I'm kind of getting at here is that when we are looking at integration in general, because I think it's the integration that is failing migrant homeless individuals and families, for me, kind of four things are standing out. One is de-mainstreamizing migrant homelessness. In other words, the migrant homelessness is becoming domain of migrant organizations, refugee organizations, some friendly church at the end of the road. It has to be as much as needs of individuals who happen to be born abroad, are not British. They actually might be British, as far as we know. I mean, there are naturalized homeless people, obviously. These needs are privatized to migrant sector, and migrant sector is being starved out of money and volunteers and skills. So we get to this loop. Privatization of community policing is another big one, because issues that affect migrant communities are quite often marked as cultural issues. They are not cultural issues. Crime is a crime. Exploitation is exploitation. Violence is violence. What I'm saying is that if we allow that to be privatized, outsourced to community networks themselves, as much as it's valued support for victims, it might not be necessarily the tool to deal with policing issues. And that affects exploitation scale in migrant communities that is quite significant, and that exploitation might be coming from whatever source. It doesn't have to be internal. Finally, the last thing I want to say is, I don't know if the word exists, but I want to say issuization. So making issues out of migrant problems. Just to give you an example. So what I was saying basically is about this. The fact that migrants are homeless is not a migrant issue. It's the issue of people who are migrants. This is the problem of people who are migrants, and they have rights to support and advice and protection as much as anyone who is homeless. Now, issuization, just to give you an example, for example, the horrific violence that is experienced by homeless migrants on a daily basis, pretty much. Hate crime is just unreal, what's happening there. I'm sure that all frontline organizations present here can confirm what I'm saying. Now, if we are looking at this problem from purely racial point of view, racial hate incidents point of view, which is true, we are missing the systemic problem of issuizing this problem, because part of it is fighting for resources. Is the fact that this person who has been burned in their tent, as it happened not for a long time ago in London, father and son, Romanian I think they were, I don't know what was the reason, but I can imagine that whoever had an idea to burn people alive in their tent might have been thinking that they are burning down a homeless person rather than a homeless Romanian person. So there are two sides of this horrible coin, and I'm calling to look at both of them, because that will help to mainstreamize the migrant homelessness back where it is. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I'm about to come on to the politicians who can hopefully respond to some of what's been raised. I'll do my best Mr. Speaker impression and ask you to keep to time so that we can make sure we have a bit of time for questions in at the end. So Bambos, I'll come to you first.
Thank you. And just to pick up on some things that have been said before, as Katia mentioned, the roots of the problem with homelessness are in the hostile environment. I was just looking up what had been said about the Immigration Act 2014, and one of the objectives of the Immigration Act 2014 was, and I quote, to prevent illegal immigrants accessing and abusing public services and the labour market. And that is the crux of what part of the problem has been and why we are where we are today. We had a debate recently in Parliament, Westminster Hall debate, where we looked at undocumented migrants, trying to get an amnesty for undocumented migrants. There are 800,000 people who are undocumented migrants. And if you think about that, those are 800,000 people that have no access to services such as work, accommodation, health, benefits. So they are living in this grey economy where they are more prone to be exploited, to be involved in activity that is below the radar, and that makes them deeply vulnerable and at great risk. And that is where we are with these particular problems. It's been made worse since Brexit, because we have the EU settlement scheme. The EU settlement scheme currently had 6 million applicants. There's still 500,000 in the system still being processed. That's of those that have applied. There are also people who, and if you apply, you will get what's called settled status, which gives you the same rights that you had before we left the European Union if you were from an EEA country and if you had access to rights in the UK. Now, there are people who may acquire those rights, but something has to happen for them to acquire those rights, either the passage of time or some other aspect that will fulfill that requirement. And that's called pre-settled status. Now, if you have pre-settled status, again, you do not have access to those benefits. You don't have access to accommodation, you do not have access to health, you do not have access to work. Because if somebody were to give you work, if someone was to give you accommodation, they'll be breaking the law because you do not have that status. And so you can see that the roots of this are embedded in the hostile environment that was introduced by Theresa May and the government of the day. So that gives you the idea as to where the problem has arisen. And because of that, you now have a situation where the government is in conflict with itself. On one level, it wants to help reduce homelessness. It wants to be proud of the fact that it's got these rough sleeping targets that it's trying to meet. But on the other hand, it's still perpetuating the hostile environment. If you want an example of perhaps perpetuating it further, look no further than the Borders Bill, which is seeking to criminalise people on the way they arrive in the UK to seek refuge. And that gives you an idea about the philosophy of where this government is. In addition to that, there are huge pressures on local authorities and other public sector bodies in trying to look after people. Local authorities, we're going to hear from the leader of Southwark Council in a second. Local authorities have had their budgets slashed by about 50%, if not more, in the last 10 years. That was part of the austerity regime. And guess what? With the comprehensive spending review, which is going to be happening in October, the public sector will again be targeted. Because if you look at where all the splurging funding has gone for all this levelling up agenda, it will be at the expense of the public sector funding. So that's deeply worrying as well. In addition to that, we also have the issue about no resource of public funds. Again, that puts more pressure on local authorities. And local authorities are stretched. They are barely able to provide the statutory services that they're meant to provide. So this again is a recipe for disaster. We've seen the effects of Brexit recently. We've seen the issues around the highly skilled workers scheme, which again is another scheme that doesn't make sense at all. I met with employers recently. I met with the construction industry. They said in the highly skilled worker scheme, to get a highly skilled worker, such as a roofer, they allow roofers, but they don't allow scaffolders. How on earth they expect the roofers to get onto the roof without scaffolders is beyond me. Bricklayers are okay, but hod carriers are not. And again, this is the insanity of the system that they have. And what's even worse is if you've lost status, because a lot of the people that don't have status are people who have overstayed. They're people who may want to acquire status, but you know they may not have had the money to do so. So actually, if you've fallen off that ladder, it's incredibly hard to get back on. And the reason, and again, it's the government are making it harder for people. How are they making it harder? So if you want to try and get leave to remain or to get regularise your status, they have these exorbitant fees that you have to pay, which is another barrier to you being able to get out of the situation you're in. You have to have things like comprehensive sickness insurance. And again, how do you acquire that? How do you get that? And there are huge delays in processing it. So even if you're able to get everything in order, it would be, you'd have huge delays. I have people who are, I had one constituent who was an Afghan who was waiting 7 years for his asylum claim to be processed. And it took my intervention for him to get his leave to remain. But prior to that, he was living on £5 a day on an Aspen card and not able to work in that period. This is what the government is about, and be under no illusions, the cause of the homelessness is a direct result of the government's hostile policies that they've introduced, and we need to do all we can to make sure we put pressure on them to change their attitude. We need to get rid of them. I mean, that's as simple as that. We cannot tolerate any more of this. This is, if you were ever to design a system that makes it much harder for people, if you wanted to create homelessness, this is the perfect storm that they have created. And they're doing it without thinking. And okay, I'm going to quote Homer Simpson. Homer Simpson said in one episode, just because I don't care doesn't mean I don't understand. And I think that is the reality of the situation that we're in. So we need to do everything we can. I'm 100% behind the campaign that Christ will be launching. And I encourage all of you who, even if you don't live in seats where you have Labour MPs, to encourage those MPs to get involved in the campaign, get behind crisis, and to bring a change in the government's attitude to this. Because other than that, we will not solve the problem, and it will just get worse. Thank you.
And last but certainly not least, as Bambos mentioned, local authorities are often at the forefront of the fighting homelessness. So Councillor Kieran Williams from Southwark Council.
Well, thank you. For those of you who don't know, so Southwark is in central London, and we have seen an explosion in homelessness in our borough, as the country has over the last decade, but particularly over this pandemic. And I suppose I want to go back to what Matt was saying at the beginning. I don't think this is about an exceptional response for people who are not born in the UK. It's about basic provision that we should all have a roof over our head, no matter what our circumstances, for everyone in our country, a country that's one of the wealthiest in the world. So I just want to say a little bit about what I see happening in my borough, and I know happens across the country, about what we're doing locally and what I think we can and must do collectively, nationally. So what do I see? I see and meet regularly people who have no way to legally work, as you've heard. People who have no way to pay their rent. People who are living in homes with landlords who are only operating for people who are living in illegal circumstances and are exploiting them. And people who come to public services and are told that they're not entitled to anything, and whether that's from the welfare state or locally from councils. I also see a Home Office that's completely failing people and inhumane, frankly, and I hope one of our first missions in government is to completely change the ethos and culture of the Home Office. As you've said, it's an organisation where I see people who take years, who are entitled to full status to be in the UK, and it takes years for them to get that status, where the Home Office themselves lose their papers, where they're wrongly refused regularly and overturned by the intervention of charities and law centres and councillors and MPs. It's completely impenetrable, and it pushes many people to use legal advisors who are not, in fact, real qualified legal advisors, and scam up people out of their documents and out of their money. And I hear stories, and I'm going to just give two given to me by our service, and these are not the real names of the people, of course, but I'll give them names because I think it matters for us to think about people as people. So Bimpi, from Nigeria, came to the UK as a child and moved to Southwark in the 90s, worked for over 2 decades in Southwark, and a couple of years ago ended up extremely ill and unable to work, and found that she had no right to benefits and no right to homelessness services. Nicholas, a European national, came across to work, started working for a building firm legally, moved over and ended up working for one outside of the legal system because that's the only work he could get, tied accommodation to that employment, bricklayer as it happens. And then last year, in the middle of the pandemic, the employer with no work to do kicked everyone out of the accommodation, and he found himself on the streets, completely unentitled to any support at all, in one of the world's wealthiest countries. And all of that is in the context, locally, for us, as you said, councils over half of their funding cut. For us, it's 63% of the funding we got from the government a decade ago taken away from us. And the same cuts to local law centres and charities that have been there to support people. And we face a much wider housing crisis. So in Southwark, we now have 16,000 people on our waiting list for a council home. And we've had 4,000 applications for people who are homeless last year. And in London, we now have 9,000 asylum seekers in hotels because the government government systems for sorting asylum seekers completely collapsed. And we see people placed in hotels overnight without any conversation with local services about the schools that will be needed, about the social care that will be needed. So what are we doing in Southwark? Well, I suppose the first thing we've been really clear on is that we will not participate in a hostile environment. So I'm very proud that we were one of the first organisations to sign up to the Support Don't Deport campaign, saying that we will not share people's information with the Home Office unless they've asked us to do so, alongside Crisis, Homeless Link and many other councils and others. We've worked very hard to make sure that EEA nationals do get their right to stay in the country. Over 59,000 people that we've supported to get their settled status by providing that support locally through our own registry office. and making sure that for rough sleepers there is support as well. So we funded Southwark Law Centre, who we're very proud to work with, who provide advice and support to make sure people who've ended up on the streets get the support they need. Over 70 people that we've supported off the street over the last 2 years had no recourse to public funds. The majority of those now have been supported to get their status settled so they can claim benefits and other things. And what's important there is they were always entitled. They just were not getting the support they were legally entitled to because of all of the barriers in the system that I've talked about. I also want to just emphasise, we talk about no recourse to public funds. It's a complete, it's not a true thing. We have 280 families in our borough who we are supporting who have no recourse to public funds because they meet social care thresholds. And they're so vulnerable in their life as children and single adults that they require social care support, and they are entitled to public funds, and we're paying for it as a council, and we've had to put in £7 million a year in a time when we've had so much money taken away from us. And all of that's part of our wider work, so we're doing much more to support people into accommodation. That's building council homes. I'm very glad that we've got 2,500 homes that we've finished or will have on site by the end of this year at the moment. We've got housing associations to build more themselves. We're bringing empty homes back into use, taking action to drive up quality in the private rented sector, and action on domestic abuse, family support, employment support. We have our own employment support service that's not linked to benefits. Anyone can go in and get help to get a job. And really importantly, we're campaigning actively to get people to join a trade union as well, to drive up the standard of employment. But what do I think we need to do more of? Well, I think we need to end the hostile environment and talk about a fair environment. And I think that's what the British people want. British people, when they understand what the rules are under the hostile environment, they don't support them. They don't think people who've been in the country working for years shouldn't be entitled to benefits if they end up out of work. They just don't. We need decent funding for people who are coming newly into the country. So the money that you receive if you're an asylum seeker or a refugee coming into Britain today is scandalous. We can afford for people to have a decent standard of living when they come here. We need a fair benefit system more broadly. It's not just people who are not born in the UK. We have a benefit system that caps the local housing allowance, caps how much you can get for accommodation. It means many, many people in my borough, no one in my borough can afford to rent in the private sector on benefits. It's just not affordable, and in many other bits of the country too. We need real sustained funding for this. The government at the moment gives a little bit of money this year, a little bit of money the next year. That's no way to have a system that really delivers their commitment to end rough sleeping. You have to have sustained funding. And we need investment in building the publicly owned housing that we all need, because if we're just dependent upon private rented housing, we will always end up in a national system where there isn't enough, for one, we know that, and where standards in some of it, not all of it, in some of it are incredibly low and not meeting people's needs. So I guess I end just by re-emphasising the point that others have been made. This isn't about an exceptional response for people who are not born in the UK. This is about making sure that everyone in our country, one of the richest in the world, can have a roof over their head. It's not a big ask. It's very basic. And we can afford it, and we can do it. Southwark, we're doing our best. Many other councils are doing the same, but we need a government that does the same too.
Thank you so much. Before I open up the floor to questions, I'm just going to use my chair's prerogative to ask a question of Bambos. So, as has been said by many of our speakers, the hostile environment is more than just a policy. It's an attitude. It's words that are used to talk about migrants, whether that be in the media or in government. And Labour has historically been part of that. I'm sure everyone remembers the Controls on Immigration mug and some of the previous language that's been used. What is Labour going to be doing now to frame, is Labour going to be actively trying to frame the conversation about immigration in a more positive light?
Yes, is a short answer, because we've seen the shortages that we're facing now. So I think things had to get worse before they got better. I think people had to realise the value of immigration, and now they've seen that we have shortages across the sector. We've seen shortages in with heavy goods vehicles, with poultry, there are shortages in agriculture, there are shortages in hospitality. And these were jobs that people were doing before. They were quite happy getting on with that. They were paying their taxes, they were making a contribution. But for whatever reason, the the dominance, this anti-immigration dominance linked to the European Union, linked to other things, was prevailing. And I think when now that people are seeing that they can't train enough people, that things are going to cost more, that there was a benefit to having a migration to the UK, and it was contributing to the economy. I think that will change people's attitudes. But also, you have an incompetent Home Office. I mean, it staggers me how incompetent they are. May Bullman is a brilliant journalist for The Independent. She did an FOI request on the Home Office. There are 399 asylum claims that have taken more than 10 years to process. Nothing should take that long. It shouldn't take more than 6 months to process. But here we are with an incompetent Home Office that is doing that. So we need to get the positive message across, but we also need to expose the Home Office and the government for the incompetence and the nastiness of the policies. We've got a big struggle in our hands because I'm on a bill committee, the Borders Bill, which is one of the most despicable pieces of legislation you will ever come across, that the Tories have put up on the bill committee, not people that are interested in asylum. They put up people like Lee Anderson, who is the MP for Ashfield, who won't watch England because the players have taken the knee. You know, those sort of people. I've got Jonathan Gullis from Stoke. You know, these are people who think that by being cruel and mean about how we treat people and how they arrive in the UK is going to win them votes in their seats. And I think we have a good message to tell. I think most of the UK are compassionate, are kind, and do see the value of migration, but we need to get that message across, and that's something I'm very keen to do.
Thank you. There was a piece of research that came out last year that I think showed that over 50% of the key care workers were non-UK nationals, and so therefore many of them didn't have recourse to public funds. So I can't remember who did that research, but I will find out because it was a very interesting research. So I think we're going to open up to questions from the floor. I'll ask if you can keep them brief, and I will take them in groups of 3. There is a roving microphone, so if there's anyone in particular you want to answer, then do say. But yeah, so hands up, and I will try and make sure we can get to everyone if anyone has any questions.
Thanks. I don't know if it's on. My name's Caitlin. I'm from Generation Rent, the campaign group for private renters. Thanks everyone for a really informative event. My question's around right to rent checks, part of the hostile environment that requires private landlords to check people's legal status to remain in the UK, and that has been ruled to be discriminatory to people regardless of their immigration status. I was wondering if the panel have made any assessment on the impact of us leaving the EU on right to rent and how it's going to affect people, and any views on how we can address it. I don't think it's directed to anyone in particular, so I'll let you.
Are there any other questions? If not, I've got loads, but we can take them in groups. Got one more here.
I'm Kevin from the Horsham CLP. Is education an answer here? Because clearly the Brexit referendum revealed a certain degree of xenophobia. And just to give an example, if we educated people about the original origins of the occupiers of this country, we'll find that the oldest skeleton, Cheddar Man, when it was DNA'd, turned out to be a black individual. So I think really we should be using our education system to try and get rid of these prevailing ideas about who is English and are they white, when we are the result of many waves of immigration for thousands of years.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? We'll go to the gentleman in the purple suit.
Hi, my name's Andy. I work for the Charities Aid Foundation. We also run the UK's largest charity bank. Having access to bank accounts is a huge barrier for a lot of homeless people, and I was wondering what practical steps we could be taking to make it much, much easier for homeless people, not just who are non-UK nationals, but actually for UK nationals as well, and what suggestions the panel might have for that.
Okay, thank you. So that's questions on the right to rent and the impact of even the EU, the role of education and access to banking. So I'm just going to kind of move up the table, and then there's any of those that you want to take, please do. Marley.
I'm happy to answer on right to rent. Just on that policy, on the impact of Brexit. So at the moment, the government have said that if you don't currently have settled or pre-settled status, and you are trying to, and you're currently with a landlord, then you can continue to stay in that tenancy. If the landlord then finds out that you haven't yet checked, that you haven't got status yet, then you are given 28 days to get to apply, and then if you haven't applied within that time, the landlord can potentially evict you from your tenancy. It's also that protection doesn't help people who might be looking for a new tenancy. So the protections the government have put in place for EU citizens are patchy and don't protect all EU citizens by any means. We've started to see some of the impacts of that from our research, where there were cases, for instance, of people who were waiting for their EU settlement scheme application to be processed in order to be able to find somewhere to rent. So we'll have to keep watching, but yeah, it's definitely an emerging issue.
Thank you. Matt?
Maybe attempt something on Kevin's question, because I'm not sure about education, but I think that one of the things that's becoming clear is that public attitudes and government policy are out of step, and that this idea of hostility as opposed to fairness is not right. And I think that our ability as kind of campaigners, as journalists, whoever, to point out the disparity is really, really important. And people are absolutely shocked when they see the state that people are forced to live in and what they're excluded from. And I just want to pick up a bit more on something that Katia said, because we can have conversations about whether the sort of party political rhetoric is right or wrong, controls on immigration, mugs and all the rest of it. But in real human terms, that does something to people. It does something. So homelessness already dehumanises people. The levels of hate crime, the levels of appalling kind of disadvantage people face. And then on top of that, to feel like you're not welcome in this country is intolerable. So this is not a sort of academic exercise. We need to promote the right public attitudes, because they matter for public policy and they matter for human dignity as well.
Thank you. Katja, is there anything you'd like to?
Yeah, I would like
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I would like myself to go back to the hostile environment, because I was very lucky in the sense that when I've come over in the early 90s, I was really, I integrated straight away. It was different time, New Labour and all that. So, I was made welcome. I've got friends from all over, British, Irish, whatever, So this issue came about slowly but surely. It did filter from the top by media. And it was pretty much perpetrated by what is now our Prime Minister. I will never forget those passes. I felt so humiliated. I felt so unwelcome. I related a lot to the Windrush generation in the sense that I wouldn't like to find myself 50 years, well, no, I'm not going to live that long, 30 years from now, being deported because of the wrong paperwork. And frankly, if another, in 30 years' time, there is another Tory government, chances are that's what's going to happen, because they're not going to change. They are who they are, So I go back, this narrative, I feel sorry toward the British people. You were lied. Obviously, you had a right to get the Brexit, fair enough. You were lied about the reasoning behind the Brexit. So, obviously, to justify their convoluted reasoning, they had to find a new scapegoat. So, obviously, in the 70s it was the Irish, the black, now is our turn. We are the new scapegoat, yeah? European. So, I go back to this. I'm going to be honest with you. I'm a Labour girl, but I didn't see, the only person that I remember standing up for foreigner was Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, which said, everyone is welcome. I don't remember the then leader of the opposition or anyone, no one could care really. So, you know, I go back to the narrative and I go back to the fact, please don't believe to their lie about this narrative, them and us, is us, we are human beings, please. Thank you.
Bambos, is there anything you'd like to take?
I'll take the Brexit one. So just there is a need to educate people, but I think they are being educated by the effects of Brexit. I took my car in on Friday to get an MOT, and the mechanic was saying it's terrible. I'm having to wait longer for parts to come. It's affecting my business. And if I'd known that this was one of the effects of Brexit, I would never have voted to leave. And I think things like that are, people will gradually get educated when they see the true impact of Brexit. So they may have done a great job in setting the Brexit as for the referendum, but I think now with the additional paperwork and the bureaucracy, people will notice the effects and their wants change. So I think there will be that evolution, and I think over time we will work closer together with the European Union, and we will see the benefits of being part of the EU. So I think that education will come over time.
Thank you. Kieran?
Yeah, I mean, to pick up on two things. The question about banking, I mean, absolutely, but I guess that is just one example, isn't it, of many, and the barriers to people keeping a home and accessing a home when they've lost one include finance, mental health support, debt advice. You have to provide them all, and that's been the model that we've been building up with local charities and others to make sure people have that rounded advice that they need. And then, you know, the role of all of us in making the case for a fair and welcoming society, I think, is fundamental. And as a council, we've run our Welcome EU campaign about talking about how proud we are to have EU citizens in the borough, the huge contribution they make to every walk of life, from being a parent to working in our hospitals. And equally, we've been incredibly proud of most recently, of support for Afghan refugees coming over. I suppose the one thing I'd say is we also just need to be always very clear about fairness as well. I think a good example of this is access to council housing for us. So we, as I said earlier, now have over 15,000 people on our waiting list for a council home. Now, absolutely understandably, if people on that list thought that an Afghan refugee that's arriving tomorrow is going to get one of those council homes, I think they would be upset because they've been waiting for a very long time. The fact that we're finding other forms of housing for refugees, the community supports, but we just need to be clear. It's not about exceptionalism, it's about being fair and decent for everyone.
Thank you. And Barbara?
I have plenty to say, but I will limit myself. Quickly on the finance, migrant communities are very badly affected by financial exclusion, and that goes all the way through actual finance, so access to credit and access to financial tools. But also that goes all the way to access to banking. And I was thinking about this very issue, because we have managed to work with I'm not sure how to call them, those ephemeris banks that don't have brick and mortar presence, but because of that, they are very flexible, and they allow for setting up accounts to clients with no permanent abode, for example. This is one of the big problems. Access to IT that renders, that is the first step to access online banking, is also an issue for people who are either homeless or in precarious housing situation. So telephone banking is a thing that is popular in many parts of the world where IT is failable or there is no reliable broadband. So there are ways around it, and this is the first step to actually formalize and regularize work, for example, because without that it is very difficult to maintain the work, and not maintaining this work is leading to loss of housing. A quick note on private rented sector, because we are seeing some interesting stuff happening here. In terms of our particular cohort, so Eastern Europeans, that's always been probably around roughly 85% private rented sector community anyway. The lower income, the more private centers rented sector, because this is how it works in mature capitalism, obviously. But hey-ho, what I want to say is that the issue of shared accommodation that is not licensed at HMO, rogue landlords, hot beds, and beds in shreds is massive in Eastern Europe community. Again, in many places where it's a real big problem, some West London boroughs, for example, where beds in sheds are second income for the whole population of a big borough, for example, it is made a migrant issue because they live in beds in sheds. These people, Poles, they live in it. It's not a problem, the fact that there is tax avoidance, inhumane living conditions, and so on. This is not the problem. It's the fact that we accept the conditions of living in adopted garages. The other problem with renting is that I think that I don't know whether this is renting, this is in relation to the some knee-jerk reaction of private rented actual sector, agency sector, but no one is really asking about immigration status anymore. People are just basically told they have to have guarantors. If you're a migrant and you are relatively young, you're not going to have guarantor. It's just not going to happen. So what I'm thinking here is that in terms of private sectors, this is completely different battle altogether, and I would support any campaign that works along or with private sectors, because it's much more difficult to tackle the issue of working around immigration system to still block people from accessing it. But it is interesting movements there, and I'm afraid that it's just going to be so much worse as we will have more and more short-term immigrant workforce, because where will we bed these people?
Thank you. It's a nice problem to have in the Labour fringe I wish we had more time, not that we were wrapping up early, but unfortunately I think we are at the end of our time now. I can see there's a couple of hands, people still want to ask questions, but I'm hoping that maybe our panel will be willing to stick around at the top table for a little bit, maybe to chat to anyone who wants to. I was meant to ask you all if you had a minute left of opening statements, but we are at time. Does anyone have a 10-second closing statement they would like to make? No? Okay. Well, thank you all so much for coming to join us today. I hope you have a brilliant rest of your conference. And yeah, we'll stick around at the top table if anyone wants to ask any individual questions. Thank you.
It's yours. I didn't forget it.
I would love to...
You're absolutely right about...
my card is in my coat, which is over there.